I recently saw a clip of an exchange between a street evangelist and a crowd of people that he was trying to evangelize, and at one point, an older man introduced his own contribution to the exchange by offering his own version of the problem of pain argument against the existence of God. And his remark was something like, how can God allow 6 million Jews to get murdered during the Holocaust? How can he sit by and do nothing when innocent children are abused in horrific ways or die of terrible diseases? And before the evangelist was able to respond, because this was supposed to be an interactive format, the man with the objection turned his back and walked away, refusing to listen to whatever answer might come. And it was clear that he was angry. He was gesturing aggressively, raising his voice, and in the end, he was too angry to wait for any kind of a response. And I don't think, and this is based on my own experience, which is quite extensive, that this kind of thing is exceptional, that conversations about the existence of God can evoke this kind of emotional response, which is strange when you really think about it, right? Like, imagine if two pundits were debating who they thought should be, I don't know, like the rookie of the year in Major League Baseball, and without really listening to the other person, one of them just spent most of his time and effort personally ridiculing and denouncing the other person, and then eventually just stormed away without listening to any kind of a response. If you were a witness to that kind of interaction, wouldn't you likely conclude that the enraged pundit was informed more by some personal resentment than reason and logic? And what I find with a significant sample size of atheists, which I've been exposed to in this kind of work, is that they don't just disagree with certain doctrines of religion like Christianity, they hate it in an unambiguous way. The lack of ambiguity is demonstrated by the consistent habit of relying on condescension, ridicule, and what Chesterton called the sneer. They don't just disagree, they consider the thing to be contemptible. And that hatred can compel a person to refuse any possible evidence that might be presented to them, with more than a few leading atheists having admitted this kind of a prejudice. Because what kind of a person trying to position themselves as rational would open a debate by admitting that they are unwilling to consider any possible evidence that could be presented for the existence of God? Because that would be an admission that this isn't about reason or evidence for them, but rather their own preferences and prejudices. But when pressed on this question, I've seen some leading atheists like Dawkins and Peter Atkins come to mind, admit that there isn't any possible evidence that would persuade them. For example, if they were to witness like a miracle, some event that is impossible without supernatural intervention, which is the only kind of evidence that could exceed reasonable doubt, they would rather conclude that they were hallucinating or had gone insane than admit that something supernatural had actually occurred. And of course, this standard of skepticism, which I would claim is unreasonable, can be applied to anything. If I hate the idea that the earth is round and the possibility of it being round agitates me to the point of anger and contempt for those who disagree with me, then any evidence, even evidence that I experience firsthand in support of this claim, is something that I could just chalk up to the failures of my own faculties of perception. Like my eyes and my brain are simply deceiving me. And if I did that, wouldn't that be evidence of my own irrationality on this subject? Yes, it would. Which is why atheists who demonstrate such animosity towards theism and who refuse to allow any evidence to be presented to them should be treated in the same way. These are not rational people offering reasonable degrees of skepticism. These are people motivated by emotions and personal animus, and to whatever degree that they invoke their rational faculties, it's at the service of their emotions and prejudices rather than the other way around. What I think is going on with a lot of the people who rail against the existence of God and anyone who supports that claim is described by C.S. Lewis in his autobiography, recounting the inconsistency of mind and heart that he suffered with when he was an atheist. He says this: I was at this time living like so many atheists or anti-theists in a whirl of contradiction. I maintained that God did not exist. I was also very angry with God for not existing. I was equally angry with him for creating a world. And that's reminiscent for me of another quote by G.K. Chesterton when he said, the worst moment for an atheist is when he's really thankful and has no one to thank. And that's That's true enough, but the reverse, I think, is also true for a lot of atheists, in which they find themselves outraged about some perceived injustice in the world, but have no one to direct their complaint to. As a Christian, I believe that God cares about my prayers, and so there have been times when I've complained to him, I've raised my objection, and I also firmly believe that he honors those moments. He doesn't just rebuke me or smite me for it. He receives those strained expressions, it interacts with them, and leads me towards some kind of understanding about it. But the atheist in the clip that I saw is distressed by historical events like the Holocaust and the seemingly arbitrary suffering of innocent people and children. Well and good, so am I. But my objections make sense in light of the fact that I believe in God who exists. If you don't believe there is anything more than matter and motion or the physical universe, on what grounds do you have to say that the world and the events captured in time should have been another way, which is what we're doing when we make moral objections? To say that things should be other than they are is to accuse the physical universe of being other than what it should be. How can you say that if the physical universe is all that there is? Like, if I were playing a video game and it had fixed rules and code governing those rules, and something happens that I don't really like in the game, I might object and say that, yeah, it shouldn't have been configured that way, should have been a different way. But when I do that, I'm appealing, perhaps in a futile way, to the game developers. I'm saying they should have done this differently, but if there was no game developer, if the game was all that there was, on what grounds would I have to say it should have been made differently? That would be an entirely irrational sentiment. And atheists who express outrage about their moral misgivings are basically doing this. To rephrase Chesterton's remark, the worst moment for an atheist is when he is really angry about some injustice and has no one to direct his complaint. All he can do is just shake his fist at the sky and never get any satisfaction for it, because according to his own beliefs, the sky will neither listen nor care, making it an irrational thing to do. But if you feel this relentless impulse to judge the events that occur within space and time and say they should have been otherwise, which I would argue that every single human being has done, isn't that evidence that there is something more than space and time? Isn't that evidence of a moral law that indicates that somehow the material world we live in is not realizing its fullest potential? And if so, well, then what is that potential if not something that exists outside of space and time? It makes way, way more sense to believe in the supernatural, which is that which transcends and exceeds the natural or the physical universe, when we are held captive by these kinds of sentiments. On a daily basis, we can't avoid doing that. If you think the problem of pain is unresolvable, that doesn't mean that the supernatural or that God doesn't exist, just that you aren't morally aligned with it or with him. But you can at least then level your complaint in a rational way, rather than just denouncing the universe of which you are a mere contingent part and of which doesn't care about your complaint. Can I ask you to stick around for one extra minute? Because if you enjoyed that, well, first of all, thanks for watching. But now I could really benefit from your help, which you can do in a couple of ways. You can check out my sponsor, Real Estate for Life, who is a network of pro-family real estate agents that can connect you with one in your area. So if you're looking to buy a home, check them out at realestateforlife.org. And if you can help out directly financially, I tend to trust that most of my regular viewers can afford to drop a $5 tip in my jar once a year. And if they did, I wouldn't have to worry about the financial viability of this effort. So if you do want to support, you can go to brianholdsworth.ca/support, or join me in my locals community to get exclusive content and chances to interact with me and members of the like-minded community at brianholdsworth.locals.com.